Hey everyone, I've been able to extract the loot tables from Apex Legends and it's helped me to learn a lot about how loot works. So in this video, I'll be explaining how loot differs between different zones. First, I'll explain how each item on the ground is determined by using a loot table. After, I'll explain the different loot zones. I'll then compare the difference between high, medium and low tier zones. I'll show what's different about hot drop loot too. I'll also show stats on the best places to find specific attachments, the best armor, the wingman, and the Peacekeeper. This will be a long video, so if you want to skip to certain points, just use the timestamps in the description. The goal of this video is to help you to know the best spots to find your next piece of loot, whether it's a better magazine attachment, higher level armor, or a better sight. Alright, let's jump straight in. First, let's talk about how loot is spawned in Apex Legends. Each item that spawns in Apex Legends will draw from a loot table. If you are in higher tier areas, there's a higher chance that the spawned item will be better. For example, good armor, meds, or a better weapon. However, every spawned item can still have a chance to be anything from a Mozambique to a level 4 backpack. It's just the chances are weighted based on the loot tier of that specific spawn item. So let's look at the different loot tier zones. First, here's a map that showcases the named loot tier zones. So we have purple as high tier loot zones, blue for medium tier zones, and white for low tier zones. Sometimes the loot tier for an area can change. This particular map is from a crowd-voted tool that takes data to determine how likely an area will be a certain loot tier. I'll put a link in the description. This means that sometimes things can get a little random, but for the most part, you can expect certain areas to be high tier most of the time. If you visit these areas, you do not get confirmed high tier loot. Instead, each area will have loot that will be drawn from specific low tier, medium tier or high tier loot tables. On top of these named locations, you also have the hot drop zones. This zone also has its own loot table. I'll talk about that later. We also have separate loot tables for shacks and small houses outside of specific zones. These are given their own ultra low loot tier. Interestingly, there are also special point of interest spawns. These are in specific locations in some areas of the map. For example, in the center of the pit. These draw items from a unique loot table that has a very high chance for high tier armor or meds. Okay, I think that sums up things quite nicely. Let's now look at how low tier, medium tier and high tier loot differs. It's hard to explain exactly with words, so I think I'll use graphics to better explain it as I speak. So, low tier, mid tier and high tier zones all have the same item type distribution. This pie chart explains it better. Each zone will draw from different tables in each of these item types. Higher tier zones will often have higher tier items from each of these loot tables. The weapon drops are very similar, but the most changes are found in meds, armor, attachments, backpacks and knockdown shields. As a result, I'll focus on the top items from these categories. I'll also take a look at attachments too. We'll start with low tier zones. So the top items have the following drop rates. Consider that an area may have dozens of spawns, so even if the drop rate seems low, the chances of you finding an item with a 5% drop rate, like level 1 gear shown here, is very high. Level 2 gear is considerably less likely in low tier zones though. Level 3 is very rare in low tier areas, and level 4 is insanely rare, but there's still the potential for it. Next, let's look at mid-tier loot zones with the same items. Here is what the drop rates are. The first thing to notice is the change to level 2 gear items. There's a 2 times higher chance to get level 2 armor, backpacks, knockdown shields and helmets in mid-tier zones. The chance for level 3 is still low, but it's still about 2 times more likely than a low tier zone. Level 4 gear has a 2 times higher drop rate, but it's still very rare. Medkits are about 50% more common in mid-tier zones too. Moving on to high-tier zones. Level 2 helmets, backpacks, armor and knockdown shields are about 50% more common than in mid-tier zones. This makes level 2 armor in high tier zones about 3 times higher than low tier zones. Most importantly, level 3 gear is about 1.5 times more common than mid-tier zones. Level 4 gear is 1.5 times more common than mid-tier zones too, making it more reasonable to find but still very rare. If you really want level 3 armor, it's going to be far easier if you go to high tier areas. Strangely, the Wingman and Peacekeeper is the most common in low tier zones. Then the rarity drops step by step as you go to mid tier and high tier. So if you're looking for either of these weapons, it's actually best to go to a low tier zone. Phoenix kits are also twice as common in high tier zones than low tier. You'll find medkits in equal amounts in mid and high tier, and they are rarer in low tier areas. Here is a quick drop comparison of all these standard zones. So as you can see, if you want good armor, it's far better to go to high tier or mid tier zones. Finding level 2 or 3 armor in low tier zones is 3 times harder than in low tier areas. Strangely though, as mentioned before, if you want a Wingman or Peacekeeper, you'll have a 2.5 times higher chance in low tier areas than you will in high tier. Okay, so now let's look at attachments. These still have the source file names, but it's pretty easy to understand what they are. I'll take you through everything. Firstly, pay attention to the bottom of the chart. The 3 most useful mods, the Select Fire, Choke, Skull Piercer and Turbocharger, all have equal drop rates across all zones. That means if you are looking for these, it doesn't matter where you are. Just make sure you're in one of the designated zones on the map and not in a random shack in the middle of nowhere. The same can be said for the golden and purple barrel stabilizers. After this though, things can get interesting. Generally, this is how it works. Level 1 items are the most common in low tier areas. Level 2 items are equally common in mid and high tier areas. Level 3 items are considerably more common in high tier areas. So if you want purple mags, stocks and shotgun bolts, you're best visiting high tier loot zones. Now, a quick note on sights. You will find the 1x threat scope in equal rarities all across the map. Low tier and mid tier zones are the best for short range sights, and longer range scopes are more common in high tier areas. Next up, a deeper look at hot drop zones. I'll be answering 3 main questions about hot drop zones. 1. Do hot drop zones have better loot than standard zones? 2. What are the drop rates for the golden weapons in the hot drop zones? And 3. Is there anything else special about the hot drop zones? Okay, so firstly, yes, hot drop zones do have better loot than standard zones. It's not just about the golden weapon. Hot drop zones are essentially in a tier of their own, and they offer gear that's similar to high tier zones. Both high tier zones and hot drop zones share the highest chance of all to get level 3 and level 4 armor, backpacks and helmets. Hot drop zones specifically also have a higher chance to spawn weapons, which means there will be more guns to pick up amongst the chaos. There is slightly less chance for ammo and less chance for grenades as a result of this. Here is the loot drop distribution in a hot zone. Here is how it compares to the standard areas. Interestingly, you also have a higher chance to get a Wingman and a Peacekeeper at a hot drop zone, whilst other weapons are reasonably the same in terms of drop rate. Pause the video here if you want to take a look closer at the stats for each zone. So to summarize, hot zones are essentially high tier zones with less ammo and grenades and more weapon spawns. So on top of the better loot rates, the hot zone of course has a golden weapon spawn. Each hot zone will have just one as far as I'm aware. Firstly, there's not a guarantee the golden spawn spot will actually drop a golden weapon. In fact, it's just a 79% chance. You can see the full drop rates for what it could be on the screen now. Keep in mind, these drop rates could change at any point, but this helps to paint a picture of how things are right now. Okay, now let's move on to the final thing about hot drop zones that I wasn't aware of. Like mentioned earlier, getting level 4 items is very rare, even in high tier and hot drop zone loot tables. Hot zones, however, also have a random loot spot that is similar to the golden weapon spot. This spot gives you a very high chance to get level 4 items. Here is the drop rates for this spawn. From what I can tell, there's just one of these in a hot drop zone, but if you want a high chance to get level 4 gear, a hot drop is the best place to come. What's interesting to me is that there's an 8% chance that this spawn can make both a level 4 armor and level 4 helmet appear. So that's my overview of the hot drop zone and what you can expect to get from it when you visit it. Obviously, most people will visit the hot drop zone for the chance to get kills, more so than the high tier loot. If you want high level armor and don't want to deal with the chaos, try to aim for a high tier zone slightly off the path of the jump ship. You'll get the same chances for level 4, level 3 and level 2 armor there as a hot drop zone, but it will be far safer. If you want a very high chance for level 3 armor, there is one final method. This involves searching for point of interest spawns. These are special spawns that are always the same each game. I've found 3 so far, one in the pit, one in Thunderdome, and one at the front of the supply ship on the top floor. When you find one of these point of interest spawns, you get a 20% chance for good armor, a 40% chance for a phoenix kit, and a 40% chance for a random weapon. Considering these point of interest areas are in high tier zones already, landing on these points can be a great way to improve your chances to get high level armor as soon as possible. So, summary time. Level 2 and 3 armor, backpacks, shields and helmet spawns increase massively in high tier areas. Weapon mods like the choke and high tier barrel stabilizers are found equally across all zones. The Wingman and Peacekeeper are the most common in hot drop zones and low tier zones. Other weapons are pretty equal throughout. If you want a high chance for level 3 or 4 armor, go to the point of interest areas or the hot drop at the start of a game. If you want longer range scopes or higher level attachments such as bigger magazines, higher tier zones are the places to go. Okay, so that's it for my loot analysis. I still have stats on loot ticks, supply ships, air drop rates and ultra low tier shack drop rates. If you want to see more videos about these things, let me know. Thanks for watching everyone. If you've made it this far, I've got one question for you all. What part of this video were you the most surprised about? Let me know. I'll see you in the comments. Cheerio!